Hello again. So here we are with part 3 of generative grammar, which will look at transformations. So in the early version of Chomskyan linguistics, transformational generative grammar, the transformational part referred to the transformational rules that map a sentence's underlying deep structure to its observable surface structure. So these rules account for variations like active and passive voice, and they are the core mechanism for showing relationships between the different sentence forms like active and passive. We're going to look at 4 transformations: passivization, comp deletion, data movement, and particle shift. Along the way, we'll also see pronoun deletion, what's very similar to comp deletion. So let's start with passivization. So if we have a sentence like John was led by Mary, uh, it's a passive voice sentence, right? In the theory, it was thought that its deep structure is actually its active counterpart, Mary led John. So if we're doing a syntactic analysis, we would do the tree for the active sentence, simple tree, you're very used to these by now, and then it would undergo a passivization transformation. And that involves moving the NP dominated by the sentence here, which is in the subject position. The NP dominated by sentence is always the subject, NP1. We're just going to move it to after the verb, and we're going to attach by in front of it. So by Mary moves over here to the VP. The noun phrase that's dominated by the VP, which is usually an object, right, is going to move to in front of the verb. So we're going to move John over in front of the verb. And we also have to add to the verb phrase, the morphemes be, the auxiliary verb, plus the past participle morpheme, which is represented in syntactic studies by en. You know, thinking about past participles such as written, spoken. Okay. So the transformational rule looks like this. The active sentence has NP1 followed by aux V NP2. The passive NP2 moves to the front. The aux is still there. We add these morphemes B plus N. There's the verb. And then we have by plus NP1. And that moves us from Mary past lead John to John past B plus N lead by Mary. Okay, so that's the transformational rule. We see it there again. And now we need another transformation to get to the surface structure, right? Because we didn't say John passed B plus N lead by Mary. Obviously, we need to get these morphemes in the right place in the clause. So it's called affix hopping. I think that's kind of a fun name. I think they must have been having fun naming these transformations, okay? So B plus past, because now the past tense marker needs to attach to the auxiliary verb, not to the verb lead. What needs to attach there is the past participle form, okay? So that's called affix hopping. And because we know our rules for word formation from our knowledge of allomorphy, we can easily generate the correct surface form, John was led by Mary. So again, that's how the rule works, etc. And we use those transformations to get to the surface structure. Now, Chomsky didn't say that we carry out this process every time, you know, we create a passive sentence, a passive construction. But he would argue that it's part of our underlying competence that we have. You know, we know how grammar works. We might not be able to say it explicitly, but that competence is there in our brains, okay? There is another transformation that can occur, which is by deletion. You know, we often see signs like this. English is spoken. Again, the active counterpart, notice here that we have something called a null subject, because we don't know from the surface form who's doing the speaking. So we can use this little triangle to indicate a null subject, right? And so then again, the same transformations applied. And we also add by deletion to get to our surface form. Okay. Again, it's not so much that you need to know how the theory creates these passive structures from the deep active structure. But again, it's interesting to think about how they were theorizing what language looks like as it resides in our brain. Again, our competence. Okay, now here's another example of a transformation. We're familiar with this from the second video, Generative Grammar 2, where we have a complementizer phrase rewriting a noun phrase, right? The complementizer is that, and then we can have a complete sentence. But we also know in English that we can delete the complementizer. We can say, I believe linguistics is wonderful. I think he's great. In fact, we often do delete it in spoken language, right? And the idea is that there is a trace of it there in our brain. We somehow, our competence knows that it's there, even though we don't say it. Here's just another example of what could be considered a transformation. So we could take a sentence in Spanish. Yo creo que la lingüística es maravilloso. So we would have a very similar deep structure sentence to English. Notice the inclusion of the pronoun yo. But we do know that it's probably less marked in Spanish to say, creo que la lingüística es maravillosa. And so the idea is that the pronoun's there, but it's dropped. Now, there have been people who disagree with it. They think English is a pro-add language because so many languages drop the pronoun. And so this goes to a later notion in generative grammar of principles and parameters. So principles are universal innate linguistic rules common to all human languages, such as a requirement that a sentence must have a subject even if it's not articulated. I mean, the idea is there that whenever you have a verb, there is somebody who's carrying out the action of the verb, even if it's not articulated specifically with a pronoun. And then parameters are variables within these universal principles that vary from language to language and determining the syntactic variations across languages. So the pro-drop parameter was theorized as being one of them. It's a specific parameter that determines whether a language allows for the omission of a subject pronoun. So languages are classified as either pro-drop, like Spanish or Italian, or subjects can be omitted because their meaning is recoverable from the morphology of the verb, or non-pro-drop, like English, which requires an explicit subject pronoun in most finite clauses, unless it's like a coordinate clause. Yesterday I went shopping and saw my sister. I don't need to say I saw my sister. This is part of what was called government and binding theory, a descendant of transformational generative grammar. So that's just a little idea to give you about how the theory was evolving over the years. Let's look at another transformation, which is dative movement. I think maybe if you're familiar with Latin, you might know that the dative case refers to the one receiving whatever the direct object or direct complement is. And so in English, we can say odd things like Mary baked the boys a cake. Obviously, Mary didn't bake the boys, she baked a cake. And so the idea is that the deep structure of this tree is actually Mary baked a cake for the boys. And so this would be our deep structure tree. It would have a prepositional phrase in it because that's actually the deep structure meaning of this sentence. And then it's simple to get to the surface structure. We can move this noun phrase out of the prepositional phrase and put it before the noun phrase dominated by VP. So Mary made the boys a cake. Okay, so that's again a simple transformation that shows a relationship between those two constructions. Go ahead. Here's an exercise for you to stop the video and think about what the deep structure tree would be for each of these sentences. Here you have some answers, right, that shows that the deep structure includes these prepositional phrases. Okay, and so if you do the tree, you would draw the one with the prepositional phrase, and then it's just a simple transformation to get to the surface structure. A final transformation we can look at is particle shift. Now, this meaning, Michelle turned her nose up. It's when you think you don't like something, right? You think you're better than whatever it is. And so we need to think about this difference between a preposition and a particle. A prepositional phrase, so if she's walking down the street and then she turned, right, and then headed up the street, that's a prepositional phrase. But if she used a bulldozer to dig up the street, to turn it up, then that's what's considered a particle. And it's theorized as coming off the verb phrase, just attached to the verb. Okay, we could have put it here as well, verb plus particle. Okay, so they're different and they have different meanings. Up is doing different things. Now, interestingly, in English, we can move this up, right, to after her nose, okay? But in the deep structure, it's seen as attached here to the verb. So the surface structure, it's simply called particle shift. Mary turned her nose up. Now let's look at another example. The workers dug up the street. So that's dug plus a particle. And if I ask you, what did the workers do to the street? You actually have to say the workers dug it up. So the particle shift is obligatory when we use a pronoun. We can't say the workers dug up it. Okay, we can say the workers dug up the street, but we can't say the workers dug up it. Okay, so that's a little bit on particle shift. It's obligatory when we use a pronoun instead of a noun. So just to practice it, you can think about where each down would be located in the deep structure tree of these two different sentences. And if I asked you about number 2, what did he do to the door? How would you answer this? And what is the name of the transformation that has taken place? Very simple. And here are the answers. So now that you know a little bit about early transformational generative grammar, we can think about how the syntactic theory progressed from transformational grammar, which looked at these deep and surface structures with transformational rules, to the government and binding theory. We've seen just a brief mention of principles and parameters. And the most current iteration is the minimalist program, which seeks to explain language with the fewest possible principles. And just to give you an example, and again, I don't think we need this for language teaching, but again, my goal is for you to think about how the theory works and what it's theorizing. It's theorizing, this knowledge we have about language, our linguistic competence that resides in the brain, and which is not necessarily something that we can raise to our awareness, to our consciousness. So minimalist program uses these labels: tense phrase, determiner phrase, and tense. Tense phrase replaces sentence because every clause is centered around tense, so not just a vague sentence unit. So instead of S, it's called a tense phrase. The tense head, the T head is often an auxiliary like is, was, has, will, or a null tense in infinitives. So in John is happy, the clause is a TP headed by is. Okay, so the tense is the head. Right? A determiner phrase replaces noun phrase. So instead of saying a phrase like the dog is an MP headed by the noun dog, the theory said it's a determiner phrase headed by the determiner the. And now it could be null. Okay, so, if we just had dogs, I like dogs. The idea is that determiner in that context is null. Okay, so that's just something about the determiner phrase. Tense is a distinct category. As we said, it has its own syntactic head, and it includes auxiliaries, modals, or tense inflection. Okay, so now you know just some basics of generative grammar, the theory, its goals, how it works for analyzing language as part of our human genetic makeup. And now we need to think about applications to language teaching. So for that, there's some readings followed by discussion. So I will see you later in the discussion forum at some point, or again, if you want to meet up and talk, I love to do that. Okay. So I will see you. Bye.